Tom Cruz kicked off Jimmy Kimmel's show. After fiery Showdown, the studio lights buzzed overhead, a low hum that barely cut through the tense atmosphere settling over the soundstage. The cameras perched like watchful eyes, their red lights blinking in sync with the pulse of the crew members hustling around. The stage was polished, the chairs arranged perfectly, the audience murmuring in anticipation. It was another night on Jimmy Kimmel Live, but tonight felt different, like the calm before a storm. Tom Cruise stepped into the studio, his presence immediately commanding. He was dressed sharply, his tailored suit cutting a precise silhouette against the vibrant backdrop of the set. The crowd erupted in applause, their cheers echoing off the walls. For decades, Tom had been the embodiment of Hollywood action, a star whose intensity, both on and off screen, had become the stuff of legend. But tonight, he wasn't here to promote a new blockbuster or reminisce about iconic roles. He had come to set the record straight. The rumors had been swirling for weeks, tabloids feasting on every whisper of personal strife, spinning tales of estranged family ties and faltering stardom. They painted him as a control freak, a man obsessed with his legacy, a distant figure to those who once held his trust. Tom, always a professional, had tried to ignore the noise, focusing on his latest humanitarian project, a global initiative providing clean water to remote communities. It was work he believed in deeply, a mission far removed from the glitz of Hollywood. But tonight the spotlight was different. He could feel it, the weight of eyes watching, the heat of expectations hanging thick in the air. Jimmy Kimmel, known for his sharp tongue and playful jabs, had built a career on finding the cracks in the polished facades of his guests. He thrived on chaos, on pushing boundaries, on turning the mundane into the extraordinary. And tonight, Tom Cruise was his target. Tom strode across the stage, his stride confident, each step deliberate. He reached the guest chair, gave a small nod to the audience, and took his seat. Kimmel, already seated behind his desk, leaned forward with a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Ladies and gentlemen," Kimmel's voice cut through the applause, "the one, the only, the man who runs faster than my Wi-Fi, Tom Cruise." The audience erupted again, but Tom's smile was measured, his eyes sharp. He settled into his chair, adjusting his jacket, his mind already running a dozen scenarios ahead. "Tom," Kimmel began, his tone light but edged, "it's good to have you here. I'm surprised you had time, what with all the running and jumping off buildings you do." Tom chuckled, leaning back. "Well, I had to slow down eventually, Jimmy. Thought I'd stop by and see what kind of chaos you're stirring up tonight." Kimmel's grin widened, his fingers drumming lightly on the desk. "Oh, chaos is my specialty," he said, his tone slipping into a sharper register. "Speaking of which, I heard you've been busy with some personal matters." Tom's jaw tightened, his smile slipping just a fraction. He had expected this. Kimmel's style was like a snake coiling around its prey, slow, deliberate, and unrelenting. "Personal matters," Tom repeated, his tone even. "I'm here to talk about the Clean Water Project, Jimmy. I think it's a cause worth spotlighting." Kimmel leaned back, his grin unwavering. "Oh, I'm sure it is. But come on, Tom. We all know the headlines. It's not just about water these days, is it?" He leaned forward, eyes gleaming. "How's everything at home, Tom?" The crowd's murmur intensified, a low rumble of anticipation. Tom's eyes narrowed, the corners of his mouth tightening. This was the opening jab, the crack Kimmel hoped to widen into a fracture. "I'd prefer to focus on the work," Tom replied, his voice low but firm. "That's why I'm here." Kimmel smirked, sensing the tension thickening between them. Of course. But you know people are curious. They want to know the real Tom Cruise, not just the guy saving the world on screen, but the man behind the curtain." Tom leaned forward, his eyes locking onto Kimmel's. The playful tone had evaporated, replaced by a cool, dangerous intensity. "You want the real me, Jimmy, all right, let's get real." Kimmel's grin faltered, just a flicker, but enough for Tom to notice. He felt the crowd's attention tighten, the camera lenses zooming in as if drawn by the gravitational pull of the moment. The first crack in Kimmel's armor had appeared, and Tom wasn't about to let it close. "We can talk about the work," Tom continued, his voice sharpening, "or we can sit here and play this game of yours. But if you want to drag my life into this, be prepared for a conversation you can't control." The air in the studio thickened, the low hum of the lights, now a pulse matching the beat of the audience's racing hearts. Kimmel blinked, his smirk now a thin, brittle line. Tom leaned back, his eyes never leaving Kimmel's face. He had made his move, and now the game was on. As the cameras rolled back, the stage lights intensified, casting sharp shadows against the studio walls. The audience, still buzzing from the tense exchange, leaned forward, sensing that the show had just shifted gears. Tom's fingers gripped the armrests of his chair. His jaw set, his eyes fixed on Kimmel. This was no longer just a talk show, it was a battleground, and he was done pulling punches. Kimmel adjusted his suit, his eyes flicking nervously to the audience before regaining his composure. "All right, Tom," he said, his voice a touch too light, a hint of strain cracking through. "Let's get real then. You've built an empire on impossible missions, death-defying stunts, and relentless drive. But what about the things that really matter? The people close to you, the ones you don't run from." Tom's jaw tightened, a flicker of fire sparking in his eyes. "If you want to talk about my work, we can do that, but my family is off limits." "Oh, come on, Tom." Kimmel leaned forward, his grin shark-like. "Isn't that what people really want to know? Not the next mission you're saving the world in, but the man behind the curtain, the guy with secrets, the guy who keeps running." Tom leaned in, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "Careful, Jimmy, you're crossing a line." Kimmel's smirk widened, his eyes glinting with the thrill of pushing a star to the edge. The cameras zoomed in, the audience's breath collectively held. This was what they came for. "All right," Kimmel continued, leaning back with a feigned air of casualness. "We'll play it your way. Tell me about this charity work of yours, the one that's supposedly close to your heart." Tom's eyes narrowed, his jaw unclenching slightly. "It's not supposedly close to my heart, Jimmy. It is. We're building water purification systems in areas devastated by natural disasters, giving people a second chance. Real impact." Kimmel raised an eyebrow, his smile tightening. "That's nice, Tom. Real noble. But do you ever think maybe you're doing it to distract yourself? To avoid other things?" Tom's fingers tightened on the armrests. He leaned forward, the space between them seeming to crackle. "You're reaching Jimmy." "Am I?" Kimmel's grin sharpened, his eyes glinting with the thrill of the hunt. "Or are you just hiding, running from the things you can't control?" Tom's eyes flicked to the cameras, then back to Kimmel, his jaw set, the muscles in his neck tensing. "You don't know me," he said, his voice a cold, steady blade. "And you have no idea what I'm capable of." Kimmel chuckled, leaning back, his hands clasped in mock surrender. All right, just making conversation." But the damage was done. The audience could feel it, the invisible crack in the air between them widening. Tom's breathing had quickened, his jaw set in a hard line, the veneer of Hollywood charm slipping to reveal something far sharper beneath. Kimmel leaned back into his chair, the grin still plastered on his face, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of something, fear perhaps, or at the very least recognition that he had awoken something dangerous. Tom, still gripping the armrests, forced himself to breathe, to pull back from the edge he had so clearly been pushed to. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. As the stage lights dimmed momentarily for a commercial break, the tension on set remained thick, clinging to every surface. The audience, still buzzing from the sharp verbal clash, whispered among themselves, eyes flicking between the stage and the giant screens above. Tom sat back, his chest rising and falling with controlled breaths, his jaw still clenched, eyes locked on the flickering "live" sign, as if it were a countdown clock to another round. Kimmel shuffled his note cards, his face a strained mask of forced composure. He could feel the crack in his show's polished surface widening, threatening to split open if he didn't regain control. His fingers twitched the cards, trembling slightly, as he glanced at his producer, off stage, who was frantically gesturing for calm. The red light above camera 2 blinked back to life, and the familiar hum of the live feed filled the room once more. The audience straightened, the buzz of whispered speculation cutting off abruptly. Kimmel plastered on his trademark grin, but the edges of his mouth quivered, his eyes flickering with the remnants of Tom's warning. "Welcome back to Jimmy Kimmel Live," he said, his voice a half octave higher than usual, betraying the adrenaline still coursing through his veins. "We're here with the one and only Tom Cruz, and it's getting a little intense tonight." He forced a chuckle, the sound falling flat in the charged air. Tom leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, his eyes never leaving Kimmel. He felt the heat of the spotlight, the weight of the camera lenses trained on him, but he had long since stopped caring about how this looked. This wasn't about public image anymore. It was about control, about reclaiming his narrative. "Intense?" Tom repeated, his voice a quiet rumble that cut through the thin layer of nervous laughter from the audience. "Is that what you call dragging a man's family into your circus?" Kimmel's grin twitched, his fingers tightening around his cards. Hey, hey, we're just having a little fun here, Tom. Lighten up, it's what we do. Tom leaned back, his eyes narrowing, the set lights casting harsh shadows across the hard lines of his face. If this is your idea of fun, Jimmy, then maybe you've forgotten what real conversations look like. The crowd murmured, a few scattered claps of approval cutting through the tension. Kimmel's eyes flicked nervously to the side, catching the producer's frantic hand signals to move on, but he pressed forward, unwilling to back down. His pride, his show, his stage, all felt precariously balanced on the edge of this encounter. Look, Tom, Kimmel said, his voice straining to sound casual. I'm just trying to get to the heart of the man behind the stunts. The real Tom Cruz. The one people don't see. Tom's eyes narrowed further, his jaw tightening. You don't know me, Jimmy. You don't get to define me. Kimmel leaned forward, his elbows resting on his desk, the edge of his grin sharpening into a sneer. Oh, come on. You spend your life jumping out of planes, hanging off cliffs, saving the world on screen. But what about the things you're really running from? Tom's jaw flexed, his nostrils flaring as he inhaled sharply. The audience leaned in, the tension pulling them toward the confrontation like a gravitational force. This was no longer just a late-night interview, it was a showdown. Running, Tom's voice dropped a low, dangerous tone that sent a chill through the audience. You think I'm running from something, Jimmy? Kimmel's grin grew wider, his confidence seemingly returning as he sensed blood in the water. Yeah, maybe from yourself, maybe from the people you've left behind. The people who really know you. Tom's hands gripped the armrests, his knuckles whitening. He leaned forward, his face inches from Kimmel's, the camera zooming in to catch every flicker of emotion. You have no idea what you're talking about, he said, his voice a quiet, controlled growl. You sit here night after night making jokes at other people's expense, pretending you know their lives, their struggles, but you don't know me. The studio fell into a thick, uneasy silence. Kimmel's grin froze, the bravado slipping as he realized the depth of the line he had just crossed. His eyes flicked to the side again, catching the wide-eyed stares of his crew, the producer making frantic slashing motions across his throat, the universal signal to cut it off. But Kimmel pushed on his pride, pushing him past the point of no return. You're right, he said, his voice dropping into a lower, more menacing register. Maybe I don't know you, but the world thinks it does, and that's the Tom Cruise they see. Tom's eyes locked onto Kimmel's, his gaze icy, unblinking. He leaned back, slowly releasing his grip on the armrests, his composure returning. You think you know me because of what you read in the tabloids, because of what you see in your gossip rags? You have no idea. Kimmel opened his mouth to retort, but the words caught in his throat. He had poked the bear, and now he could see the fire smoldering just beneath the surface. The audience sat frozen, the room crackling with anticipation, the thin veneer of comedy long gone. You wanted a reaction, Jimmy? Tom said, his voice steady, each word a quiet, measured blow. Congratulations, you got one. The camera lights blinked, the red recording signs reflecting in Tom's steely eyes. He leaned back, crossing his arms, his presence filling the studio with a silent, overwhelming intensity. Kimmel, his face pale, his fingers trembling around the stack of note cards, forced a weak, hollow chuckle. Well, he stammered, that's live TV, folks. But no one was laughing. As the stage lights flared back to life, the audience's murmurs grew into a low, anxious hum. The air was thick with anticipation, a palpable tension that clung to every corner of the studio. Tom's stare had never broken from Kimmel. His eyes' dark jaw clenched, a statue of defiance carved into the leather chair. He had taken Kimmel's bait, but he wasn't about to be reeled in easily. The camera zoomed in lenses like the hungry eyes of vultures circling a fresh battlefield. Kimmel adjusted his tie, a nervous tick, betraying the confident grin still plastered on his face. He leaned forward, fingers tightening around his cue cards, his eyes flicking toward the monitor where the tabloid headlines still blared like warning sirens. He had pushed his luck, and the audience sensed it. So, Tom Kimmel said, his voice straining to sound casual, you've always been a man of action. Always pushing the limits, defying the odds. But I've got to ask, how do you keep running when everything around you seems to be falling apart? Tom's jaw tightened further, the muscles in his neck visibly coiling. He leaned forward, his posture shifting from defensive to offensive, his voice a low growl. You want to talk about falling apart, Jimmy? Let's talk about the real you for a second. The audience inhaled sharply. Kimmel's grin froze, a flicker of panic flashing across his eyes. This wasn't on the script. Oh, come on, Tom. Kimmel tried to wave it off, his laugh forced brittle. This isn't about me. Tom's gaze didn't waver, his eyes boring into Kimmel's. No, you wanted real, right? You wanted to cross the line, so let's cross it. You sit here night after night, tearing people down for laughs. You hide behind your desk, behind your jokes, because it's easier to mock than to stand up for something real. Kimmel's smirk twitched, his fingers tightening around his cue cards. The audience was deathly silent now, the tension a live wire sparking in the air. You think you're safe up there, throwing punches without ever stepping into the ring? Tom continued, his voice rising, each word sharp cutting. You poke at people's lives, their struggles, their families, and you think it's all just part of the show. You think there are no consequences. Kimmel swallowed his eyes, darting to the stage director, the silent plea for a cut to commercial ignored. He had no escape now, cornered on his own stage. Tom leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. You've made a living off of other people's pain, Jimmy. But what happens when the cameras turn off, when the laughs fade, when the only person left to face is yourself? Kimmel's face blanched, the smirk gone, his fingers trembling slightly on the desk. The studio lights seemed harsher now, exposing every line, every crack in his facade. You sit here acting like a king, but deep down you're just as scared as the people you mock. Tom continued, his words a relentless barrage, scared of being forgotten, scared of being exposed, scared of facing the fact that without this desk, without this stage, you're nothing more than a man with a script and a spotlight. A hush fell over the room, the air thick and suffocating. Tom leaned back, his eyes still locked on Kimmel, his breathing steady, controlled. The tables had turned. The hunter had become the prey. For a moment, neither man moved. The cameras continued to roll, capturing every second of the unfolding reckoning. Kimmel's hand shook, his knuckles white against the polished surface of the desk. He forced a laugh, the sound hollow, desperate. Well, this got a little intense, didn't it? Tom's eyes narrowed, his face an unreadable mask. You wanted a show, Jimmy. Welcome to the real one. The studio felt different now. The once bright stage lights had taken on a harsher tone, their beams cutting through the air like blades. The audience, still buzzing from Tom's blistering retort, leaned forward, sensing the tides had shifted. Kimmel, usually in control, his grin a permanent fixture, now seemed smaller behind his desk, the bravado slipping his eyes, darting nervously as Tom sat back, his expression one of cold, calculated fury. The cameras captured every tense second, the low whir of their motors, the only sound cutting through the strained silence. Tom adjusted his cuffs, his jaw-set eyes unblinking as they locked onto Kimmel's. The veteran host fingers, still clutching his cue cards, managed a weak chuckle, the sound hollow and echo of his usual self. So, Tom Kimmel finally stammered, his voice tinged with a forced casualness. You've always been about control. The guy who does his own stunts, who pushes every limit. But I guess some things are just out of control, huh? Tom's lips tightened, the muscles in his neck flexing. He leaned in, his voice a low, steady rumble. You want to talk about control? Jimmy, let's talk about it. The crowd tensed, sensing the crackle of electricity in the air. Kimmel's smirk faltered, his eyes narrowing. He knew he was on the edge of a precipice, but he couldn't back down now. He leaned forward, his elbows resting on the desk, a faint sheen of sweat glistening on his brow. Control. Tom, is that what this is about? Kimmel said, his voice climbing in pitch, the strain clear. You come here, sitting in my chair on my stage, trying to turn the tables. He let out a strained laugh, his fingers tapping nervously against the desk. You know you've been playing the hero for so long, I wonder if you even remember what it's like to be a real person. Tom's eyes narrowed, his jaw clenching, a flicker of something dangerous flashing in his gaze. A real person, Jimmy, he said slowly, his voice dropping to a near whisper that cut through the studio like a blade. You want to talk about real things. All right, let's get real. Kimmel's smirk returned, though weaker, a pale imitation of his usual confidence. Sure, Tom, real. Like those stories we keep hearing, the whispers, the headlines. He gestured grandly to the screen behind him where tabloid clippings flickered, mock articles, scandalous headlines, each one a jab at Tom's tightly controlled public image. Tom's eyes followed the flickering images, his jaw tightening further. The audience leaned in their breaths, held the tension, a living thing that crackled through the air. "Is that all you've got?" Tom said, his voice steady, eyes never leaving the screen. Headlines. Gossip. The same recycled garbage that's been thrown at me for years. You think that's real? Jimmy Kimmel's eyes flashed his grin, tightening into a thin line. It's what people see. Tom, it's what they believe. Tom leaned forward, his eyes locking onto Kimmel's, the intensity of his stare unblinking. You should know better than most that the truth isn't what sells. It's the lie. It's the drama. It's the spectacle. You make a living off of it, feeding on the doubts, the fears, the insecurities of others. Kimmel's face twitched, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his features. He glanced at his cue cards as if searching for a lifeline, but found none. Tom's voice dropped even lower, his tone colder now. You want a headline, Jimmy? Here it is. You're nothing without the people you try to tear down. You sit here night after night acting like the puppet master pulling strings, making people dance for your amusement. But the truth is, without this desk, without these cameras, without someone else's misery to laugh at, you're just another scared little man clinging to relevance. The crowd gasped, the studio hair growing thicker, the temperature seeming to rise as the power dynamic continued its brutal reversal. Kimmel's smirk had vanished completely, his fingers now clutching the edge of his desk, his knuckles white. You think you can come in here and lecture me? Kimmel shot back, his voice shaking, a bead of sweat trickling down his temple. You think you're better than me? Just because you've got a couple of blockbuster hits under your belt, because you do your own stunts. Tom leaned back, his gaze never breaking his silence, a weapon as sharp as any blade. He crossed his arms, his expression one of grim satisfaction. I don't need to be better than you, Jimmy. I just need to be better than the man you pretend to be. A heavy silence fell over the studio, the audience too stunned to react, the cameras capturing every second of Kimmel's unraveling. He glanced around, eyes darting to the crew, to the exit, to anywhere but the intense, unyielding stare of the man sitting across from him. Finally, Kimmel forced a chuckle, the sound cracking under the strain. All right, Tom, you made your point. Let's move on. But Tom didn't move, his eyes still locked onto Kimmel's, his jaw set, his presence a quiet, seething force. No, Jimmy, he said, his voice low, each word deliberate. We're just getting started. The audience had been pulled into the storm, their eyes wide, breaths shallow, as the air in the studio grew thick with unspoken fury. The cameras zoomed in, lenses practically trembling as they captured the standoff between Tom and Kimmel. This was no longer just a late-night talk show segment, it had become a psychological battlefield, each word a shot fired, each glare a challenge. Kimmel leaned back, forcing a thin smile, but his fingers gripped the edge of his desk, the knuckles turning white. He had underestimated Tom's resolve, misjudged the steel behind the actor's polished exterior. Now the cracks in his facade were starting to show, and the audience could sense it. Tom's eyes never left him, twin storms locked onto a man desperately clinging to control. So Tom, Kimmel began, his voice straining to sound casual, we've talked about your projects, your stunts, the amazing things you do on screen, but let's talk about something a little more real, something closer to home. Tom's jaw tightened, a flicker of tension crossing his face. He leaned forward, eyes narrowing. Careful, Jimmy. Oh, come on. Kimmel pressed his tone, shifting, turning sharper like a blade being drawn. Everyone has their secrets. Everyone has their regrets. The crowd hushed, their anticipation a living thing. Tom's gaze hardened, his presence a coiled spring ready to unleash. Kimmel was playing a dangerous game, and the stakes were rising. You talk a lot about pushing limits. Tom, Kimmel continued, his grin tightening. But what about the ones you've crossed? The people you've left behind in your climb to the top? Tom's fists tightened, his breathing steady but deep, his eyes locking onto Kimmel's with an intensity that silenced even the murmurs in the back rows. You really want to go there? Jimmy, Tom's voice was low, each word a slow, deliberate warning. You really want to open that door? Kimmel hesitated, a flicker of doubt breaking through his confident veneer, but he pushed on. He had to. It was his stage, his show. He couldn't back down now. The cameras were still rolling, the audience still leaning in, waiting for the next explosion. I'm just saying, Kimmel shrugged his smirk, returning to a weaker, that for a guy who plays heroes on screen, you've got a hell of a lot of baggage in real life. The room went deathly quiet. Tom's eyes burned the lights, casting hard shadows across his face, making him look every bit the action star, ready for the final showdown. "You don't know a thing about me," Tom said, his voice sharp as a blade cutting through the silence. "You sit there hiding behind your desk, poking at people's lives like it's all a joke. But you don't have a clue what it means to stand for something." Kimmel's smirk slipped just a fraction, his fingers tightening on the note cards in his hand. He forced a chuckle, but it came out hollow, the sound echoing off the silent walls. "I stand for a lot." "Tom," Kimmel shot back, leaning in, trying to reclaim his ground. "I stand for calling out hypocrisy, for keeping things real." "Real?" Tom leaned in his face, a mask of controlled fury. "You think this is real? This circus you run, these cheap shots you take at people for laughs, that's not real, Jimmy. That's just noise." Kimmel's face flushed, his eyes flicking to the cameras, then back to Tom. He could feel the tide turning, the control slipping through his fingers like dry sand. "All right," Kimmel said, his voice tightening, desperation seeping into his tone. "You want to get real fine? Tell me, Tom, what drives a man like you? Is it the fame? The money? Or are you just running from something?" The air in the studio grew colder, the lights suddenly feeling too bright, the stage too small to contain the two forces clashing on it. "I'm running toward something, Jimmy," Tom said, his voice low, but cutting each word a calculated blow. "I'm running toward purpose, toward meaning. I'm not hiding behind a desk throwing stones at people from the shadows." The crowd was silent, drawn in by the sheer weight of the moment. Even the crew, usually indifferent to the drama unfolding on stage, had stopped, their eyes fixed on the confrontation. Kimmel opened his mouth to fire back, but no words came. For the first time in a long while, the king of late night had been rendered speechless. Tom leaned back, his eyes never leaving Kimmel's, his presence as solid and unyielding as a mountain. "So, Jimmy," Tom continued, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, "if you want to have a real conversation, we can do that. But if all you're going to do is hide behind cheap shots and smirks, then maybe you're the one who should start running." The audience exploded into applause, the sound crashing over the set like a wave, drowning out whatever response Kimmel might have had. Tom straightened his jaw, set his eyes still locked on Kimmel, unblinking, unbroken. As the stage lights dimmed for another commercial break, Kimmel leaned back, his face pale, his hands shaking slightly as he fumbled with his note cards. Tom leaned back too, his face set, his eyes still burning. This wasn't over, not by a long shot.